The Further Education of OverSoul 7 by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John. Chapter 5. The Beginning of the Search and a Demon in the Foothills. Lydia was feeling petulant. "I thought that after death you were supposed to know all about God or whatever," she said. "And even though I didn't believe that I had a soul when I was physical, I thought that souls, if they existed, would at least know the answers. Instead, here I am, helping my oversoul to go track down the gods. After all I've been through, I'm not certain of anything." "Shush! Will you be quiet?" Seven cried, exasperated. "We're in someone else's territory, I can tell." Lydia grabbed a cigarette from the pocket of a hastily hallucinated trench coat and looked around nervously. "What do you mean, someone else's territory?" She squinted. Things were changing. There were walls and walls of shadow that weren't there before, and they were advancing. To test her perceptions, Lydia stood still, and sure enough, the walls seemed to come closer, stealthily. "On Earth, it would be like an alien country," Seven said, "when you don't know the rules and don't like the looks of the place. Just take my hand and be quiet." He sounded much more confident than he felt. The area was drenched with personality characteristics that he found most distasteful. Fear was draped invisibly but definitely over everything, like a heavy, suffocating vine that choked out all other growth. And anger crawled in and out of all the tiny crevices that suddenly opened up around their feet, spreading like miniature earthquakes. Seven didn't like the feel of it at all. But as yet, the various elements were diversified. By steering Lydia and himself carefully, he managed to follow the few clear spots still open. At the same time, Oversoul 7 felt the fear and anger collecting itself. It belonged to someone or something. Lydia hadn't made a wisecrack in what seemed a century. She was beginning to shiver. Instantly, he hallucinated a big brown handbag with a revolver inside. The bag swung from shoulder straps that fit over her trench coat. The automatic hallucination of objects was something Seven had tried to teach her without success until now. But she was so frightened that she never noticed her success. A presence was slowly gathering about them. The fear and anger were literally taking shape. Seven felt a thickness grow before he saw it. A gigantic, swirling, black-centered, demon-like form. Despite himself, he stepped backward. The demon, or whatever it was definitely there, rising out of the shadow walls. Yet, on the other hand, there was something not there about it, too. Lydia opened her handbag and reached for her revolver. As she did so, the thing began to speak, or at least words came from somewhere, though Seven knew that the creature's tongue could have no powers of its own. And as it spoke, like a giant evil porcupine, it sent out darts of terror that struck into well, psychological skin, while foul odors sithered like snakes from it, coiling everywhere. Lydia dropped her handbag. The ground beneath it turned into quicksand, swallowing the handbag, revolver and all. "Well, do something," Lydia stammered. Seven closed his eyes. He opened them again. Nothing had changed. "We're on our way to visit the gods," he said politely. A gigantic chuckle began somewhere nearby, and built up, and grew until the sounds drowned out OverSoul 7's thoughts as well as his hard-earned composure. Giant teeth appeared in the sky, too close to the ground for comfort. They clanked up and down with each God-forsaken gasp of laughter, and the open mouth showed a gullet path that led into distances too far even for Seven's imagination. Lydia was sobbing. Seven was frightened enough, and confused. He whispered to Lydia, "I thought you didn't believe in demons." "I don't really know if I believe in gods or not, but I believe in demons all right," Lydia muttered, staring at the huge teeth which now were fading with original monster shape come closer. "There aren't any demons," Seven said urgently. "You've got to believe me." "Then what's that?" Lydia cried angrily. "Kneel down and adore me, or be annihilated," demanded the voice, issuing from the creature but also seeming to come from the ground beneath their feet, and from the sky as well. OverSoul 7 finally got his mental footing. "Okay," he said agreeably, borrowing Lydia's expression on purpose. Lydia grabbed Seven's arm, shouting, "Oh, how could you? You'll be bowing to evil." "Will you let me handle this?" Seven almost yelled. "Bow down, with your belly on the ground," insisted the monster, hissing now. "Never!" Lydia screamed, trembling. She advanced, saying the Lord's Prayer, which she suddenly remembered. "Our Father—" "Lydia, that's useless," Seven said. But Lydia was beyond listening. "Bow down and adore me," the monster raged. "Who art in heaven," Lydia prayed. It was going to be a metaphysical shouting match, Seven thought, somewhat angrily himself now. "You don't really believe in God the Father," he reminded Lydia, as gently and considerably as he could under the circumstances. "But you do believe in demons." "Hallowed be thy name," Lydia said, between clenched teeth. She was just yards from the creature, who was now very rapidly approaching, constantly changing shapes. "Adore me," it commanded, "or be annihilated." "Annihilated!" Lydia cried, so frightened that she almost forgot to pray. Seven didn't dare wait any longer. He let his own beliefs predominate until they flooded the entire environment. The monster disappeared just as the huge mouth, momentarily materializing, opened. Seven snatched Lydia away. She was still yelling the Lord's Prayer. "You're lucky you believe in me," Seven said, disgusted. "That was all your fault back there, and it took me a while to realize what was going on. But would you let me handle it? No, not until you were scared to death." "How did we get out of there?" Lydia asked. "I got us out." "You?" Lydia cried. "You were a coward." Some behavior for an oversoul. You were ready to do anything the demon told you to. 7 sighed. It's pretty difficult to explain all this to you when you're still in the middle of the action. Look around. What do you see? Lydia looked and looked. On Earth, the landscape stayed whatever way it was. Here, it seemed you couldn't be sure of anything. First she thought that she saw a row of trees, prickly shapes in space, and once she was positive she smelled pine needles, but the next instant the same shapes wiggled and thickened in some odd fashion until they suggested steeples and a medieval street. Although something always seemed to be out there, whatever it was kept changing. Reminds me of Impressionist painting, Lydia said. Looks like someone painted wiggly trees with brushstrokes that just suggested trees. But when you really look, they aren't trees at all. She didn't like the effect much either. Her literal mind wanted one environment or the other, and she said as much. Oversoul 7 grinned. He'd changed himself into his version of an artist, a rather antiquated version in Lydia's eyes, for he was wearing a brown robe and beard to match, and gesturing with a paintbrush straight out of the 14th century. Your mind is painting the pictures or forming the environment, he said. I'm purposely letting your mind predominate right now. Earlier you formed the demon because, as far as your beliefs are concerned, gods and demons are connected. Look for one, and you automatically find the other. Worse, your belief in God the Father was far weaker than your certainty about demons. So your prayers were only an exercise in futility, and in a way, they only reinforced your belief in evil. You really believe that evil is stronger than good. Well, there certainly seems to be more of it on Earth, Lydia said tartly. I don't see how you can sidestep the entire issue. At least I rose to the challenges of the encounter. You won't really believe any gods exist unless you meet some demons along the way. Is that it? 7 asked. Because if it is, you might get more than you bargained for. And I'd just as soon not watch. Watch? You mean you wouldn't help? It was hard for Lydia to concentrate. The environment turned from a shadowy boulevard to a shadowy back street in some town in Ohio, where she remembered living at one time or another. It was as if space kept advancing and retreating, always carrying different images, or like staring into a shop window where the reflections almost came alive and were as real as objects. The gods, she thought, were probably just reflections too. Stop staring, 7 cried. You're getting the edges of your reality blurred, and we aren't ready for that yet. For what? She asked distractedly. She wished that he'd be quiet because suddenly the images were becoming much clearer, and she could almost hear voices. Lydia, 7 shouted, don't let your mind drift so. But it was too late. She wasn't ready yet, 7 thought miserably. For that matter, he didn't know if he was either. But there was nothing for him to do but follow her and her beliefs. The reflections shimmered, thickened, into sparkling kaleidoscopes of cubes and circles, piled one on top of the other, all dissected by a strange glinting light against a dark purple sky. Then, in an instant, the whole thing gelled, settled into a solidity so perfect that the new castles and palaces carried an air of ancient elegance, a sturdy, jeweled splendor that surely was old when the earth was new. "Why, it's the land of the gods, just as I once imagined it." Lydia was so excited that she could hardly speak. OverSoul 7, still carrying his paintbrush, sighed. He knew, or he thought he knew, where all this would lead them. But he couldn't just step in and direct Lydia. The search would have to follow her own desires and beliefs. Her desires didn't worry him, Seven thought, but her beliefs were another matter. The air was so clear and sparkling, though, that Seven found himself exhilarated. "And it's the most fantastic summer day you could ever imagine," Lydia exclaimed. "That's just it," Seven wanted to say, but he didn't. As Lydia's mood soared, her dungarees and trench coat were replaced by a silver suit of armor like one Joan of Arc had worn in a picture Lydia had seen as a child in her previous life. And here she was, Lydia, brave and young, splendid in her determination, out to find the gods, and more. She'd found them, or almost. Seven almost moaned, picking up her images. She'd been 18 when she'd seen the Joan of Arc illustration and had imagined the present scene, which was quite real, of course. "Well," she said, "we did get rid of the demon one way or another, didn't we? He must have guarded the land of the gods." Seven gave up for the moment. "Right," he said dourly. The scene was quickly taking on all dimensions of actuality. Mountains appeared in the distance, roads and paths arching over them, trees materialized, growing to full size in the flash of an eye, lakes almost spilled over with soft water. Lydia said, "Oh, it's all so unbelievable that I have to sit here for a minute and catch my breath." "You do? You wear me out," Seven muttered. But he was proud of her. The environment was splendid. While it lasted, he thought. His robe was hot. He changed it to a silken one, though he was sure that few artists in any century wore silken gowns. Still, there could always be a first, he thought, and with some admiration he stared at Lydia. No one could say that she wasn't independent. There she was, slender, brave, and true, he thought, grinning. Her innocence and intensity were more than he could bear. He wanted to see how far those qualities could take her. More, a part of him roused up in response so that all of his own beginnings began to merge, surge, ascend. He added his exuberance to hers as it came tumbling into his experience from all the times and places that he'd known. And the scene took on that incredible clarity that defied any one reality, transcended them all, and yet was brilliantly itself and no other. The summer-scented path led up to a gigantic building that overlooked the top of the hill. They began to climb. In Chapter 5. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.